started with one sentence that would haunt the flight attendant forever. "You people don't belong in first class." The atmosphere on Flight 713 was buzzing with the usual energy of a cross-country business route. Phones pinged. Overhead bins slammed shut. Flight attendants repeated the same pre-boarding greetings with mechanical cheer. Passengers shuffled through the aisle, some chatting, others already annoyed. But as row 1 came into view, the mood shifted. Richard Allen and his family had just stepped onto the aircraft. Not flashy, but impossible to ignore. He was the kind of man who made heads turn with his presence alone, standing over 6 feet tall with commanding confidence and quiet authority. Richard wore a deep navy custom-tailored suit that hinted at his success without needing to say a word. His Rolex glinted under the cabin lights as he wheeled a slim leather carry-on beside him. His wife, Maria, walked just behind him, stunning in a soft beige trench coat and silk scarf. Her natural curls were neatly pinned back, and she walked with the grace of a woman who'd attended countless galas and board meetings. Their teenage daughter and son, both dressed smartly in slacks and sweaters, followed close behind, polite, quiet, and observant. As the family reached the front row, seats 1A and 1B, a woman in a flight attendant uniform suddenly stepped in front of them, blocking the aisle with her arm. "Excuse me," she said, her tone clipped. "These seats are reserved for first-class passengers only." Richard blinked. At first, he thought she was joking, or maybe there had been a misunderstanding. "I understand," he replied calmly, holding out the boarding passes. "These are our seats. 1A, 1B, 1C, and 1D. The flight attendant didn't even glance at the tickets. Her expression had already hardened into something else, suspicion, or worse, judgment. "There must be a mistake," she said, folding her arms. "I've seen who's been assigned to first class. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Maria's brows furrowed. "Why? We checked in an hour ago. Our names are on the boarding pass." Now, other passengers were starting to turn around in their seats, sensing something wasn't right. A white man sitting in 2A leaned forward slightly, watching with quiet curiosity. Claire, the flight attendant, looked the family up and down in a way that made it clear. She'd already decided they didn't belong. She didn't ask for ID. She didn't verify anything. She didn't do her job. Instead, she took a deep breath and said the words that would light the fuse. "You people don't belong in first class." Time froze. Maria's hand slowly gripped her husband's arm. Their son looked up, confused. Their daughter blinked, her eyes wide with hurt. Richard's jaw clenched ever so slightly. He had been in meetings with billionaires, spoken on stages across the world, and led global companies. But nothing stung quite like this, being reduced, dismissed, and disrespected in front of his children. "I beg your pardon?" Richard asked, his voice calm but razor-sharp. Claire didn't flinch. "Unless you can prove otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. You're holding up the line." He held out the tickets again. "Our names are right here." Still, Claire refused to even glance at them. "I've already reported this to the gate. Security will handle it," she snapped. Then she turned and marched down the aisle, leaving the family standing there, exposed, humiliated, and deeply confused. Passengers nearby began to whisper. "Did she just say what I think she said? Why didn't she check the tickets?" That family looks more put together than half the people in here. The Allen children were visibly shaken. Richard placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder, signaling him to breathe. Maria leaned in and whispered, "We should go, just until this is cleared up. We don't want to cause a scene." But Richard didn't move. Not yet. He stood there silently, eyes fixed down the aisle, watching Claire as she spoke into the intercom, likely calling for ground staff to escort them off. He took a deep breath. He was used to being underestimated. But this was different. This wasn't about a delayed meeting or a missed connection. This was about what she saw when she looked at them. Not wealth, not grace, not status, but skin color. That was all it took for her to decide they didn't belong. And that was going to cost her. Because what Claire didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that Richard Allen wasn't just another man in a nice suit. He was the CEO of the airline. The very plane they were standing on, the very company she worked for, All of it was his. And Claire had just humiliated the person who owned the sky she worked in. What happened next would unravel her entire career and become a story that would be heard around the world. Claire didn't just doubt them, she escalated. As if questioning their very right to breathe in first-class air, she squared her shoulders and narrowed her eyes. Her tone, dripping with suspicion, cut through the cabin like a blade. "Where did you get these tickets?" The audacity in her voice rang out like an alarm. A few heads in nearby rows turned. Conversations halted. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade under the weight of her words. Richard Allen stood tall. He was a man who had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and led global teams. But at that moment, none of it mattered. Not to her. Not to Claire. All she saw was a black man and his family in a place she didn't think they belonged. He took a breath. Calm, deliberate, practiced. "We paid for them," Richard replied evenly. "Just like everyone else on this plane." But Claire's expression didn't change. In fact, it hardened. She tilted her head slightly, lips pursing like she was dealing with a child who had wandered into a grown-up space. "Oh, really?" she said, as if she'd just caught him in a lie. "Did you really pay for first class? Or did you just think you could sneak in and no one would notice?" That did it. A few gasps broke out. A woman in row 2 shook her head in disbelief. A man near the back muttered, "This is unbelievable." Maria, Richard's wife, turned a deep shade of red, not from guilt, but humiliation. Her fingers clenched around the handle of her designer purse, knuckles widening. Her son, barely 16, pulled his backpack closer to his chest and whispered, "Why is she doing this, Dad? We didn't do anything." Richard didn't answer. His eyes were locked on Claire, studying her like he would an arrogant boardroom opponent, calculating, detached, and already defeated. They just didn't know it yet. But Claire, clearly feeling powerful, wasn't done. She reached for the intercom on the wall. Without a second glance at their boarding passes, without even verifying her assumptions, she pressed a button and made the call that would unravel her entire career. "This is Claire in cabin service," she said crisply into the handset. "We have a seating issue in first class. Possible fare evasion. I need ground support and security at the gate immediately." She hung up and turned back to the Allens with a smug half-smile that said, "Now you'll learn your place. You'll need to exit the cabin until this is resolved," she said coolly. Maria's voice finally cracked through the tension. "We have our boarding passes. Why are you doing this?" But Claire waved her off like she was nothing more than noise. "Ma'am, I'm not going to argue. You're delaying boarding for everyone else. Please step aside." The eyes of half the cabin were now locked on the unfolding drama. Some passengers looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Others kept watching, phones subtly raised, recording just in case. Minutes later, 2 uniformed airport security officers boarded the plane. Claire greeted them at the door, wasting no time. "That's them," she said, pointing to the Allens. "Row 1. They're not supposed to be here." No introductions. No questions. Just one gesture, and suddenly, Richard and his family were surrounded. One officer turned to Richard, tone stiff. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you and your family to deplane while we sort this out." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Without asking for ID? You're removing us based solely on her word." The officer hesitated but looked to Claire, who folded her arms and nodded smugly. "Please cooperate, sir. We don't want to make this any harder than it has to be." Richard looked down at his daughter, who had tears in her eyes, and then at his son, who looked like he was trying to disappear into the floor. With quiet dignity, he said, "Fine, but you'll regret this decision." As they turned and walked back down the jet bridge, the silence in the cabin was deafening. Claire stood tall, arms crossed, watching them leave with what looked almost like satisfaction. She truly believed she'd done her job, protecting first class from what? A successful black family who dared to sit in seats they rightfully paid for? She couldn't have known that in just a few moments, her own world would start to collapse. Because the man she had just humiliated, he didn't just belong in first class. He owned the whole airline. And now, he was about to show her exactly what that meant. The scene was something out of a nightmare. In front of the entire first-class cabin, Doctors, lawyers, CEOs, and everyday travelers. Richard Allen and his family were escorted off the plane like criminals. Not because they broke a rule, not because they raised their voices, but because a flight attendant had decided, on sight alone, that they didn't belong. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes fixed on their phones or looking out the window to avoid the shame of witnessing it. Some whispered softly to one another. Didn't they show their tickets? She never even checked. This isn't right. But no one said a word loud enough to stop it. Richard held his head high as they walked back up the narrow jet bridge. He didn't say a word. Not yet. Maria walked beside him, lips pressed tight, as if forcing herself not to cry. Their son followed, gripping his backpack like a shield. And their daughter, barely a teenager, sniffled softly as tears began rolling down her cheeks. As soon as they stepped off the bridge into the terminal, she broke down. Why did she think we were lying? She sobbed, voice trembling. Richard stopped, turning to face her. He gently placed his hands on her shoulders, crouching to meet her eyes. For a moment, the business executive, the CEO, the powerful figure disappeared. All that remained was a father trying to protect his child from a world that had just shown its ugliest face. He didn't have an answer that would make sense to her, because there was no sense in it. Just the cold truth he had carried with him his whole life. Sometimes, no amount of success, money, or class could protect you from prejudice. He clenched his jaw, not of rage, but restraint. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. But don't you ever think it's because of you. That was her ignorance, not your worth. Maria stood beside them, visibly shaken but trying to remain composed. She looked over her shoulder toward the aircraft, where Claire now stood in the doorway with her arms folded across her chest. The smug little smirk on her face was all the confirmation anyone needed. She believed she had done the right thing. As far as Claire was concerned, justice had been served. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined, was that she had just disrespected the wrong family. This wasn't just a man in a fancy suit. This wasn't just another wealthy couple taking a trip. Richard Allen wasn't new to first class. He was the reason first class existed on this airline. He was the CEO of the very company she worked for. The board answered to him. The policies, he signed off on them. The aircraft she was standing on, his signature helped design the interior. Claire had just embarrassed the top executive of the airline in front of passengers, crew, and now, security staff, who were beginning to realize something wasn't quite right. One of the security officers, a younger man who had remained quiet during the incident, looked at Richard again and blinked, recognition dawning on his face. Wait, sir, are you? Richard straightened up and simply said, You'll find out soon enough. He turned toward the gate agent nearby. Get me your supervisor. Now, the agent, who had overheard enough to understand the severity of what just happened, nodded quickly and disappeared behind the counter. Maria pulled out her phone and opened the airline's app. With a few taps, she accessed the reservation details. It showed exactly what they had said all along, 4 first-class seats, booked weeks in advance under the highest loyalty tier. Everything was legitimate. Everything was clean. The truth was right there. Meanwhile, back on the plane, whispers were spreading fast. Passengers had begun comparing notes. One woman pulled up her own reservation and said, I saw that man speak at a leadership summit last year. That's Richard Allen. He is the CEO. Claire, overhearing that, stiffened. No, that can't be. Her voice faltered. Her face began to lose color. Doubt crept in like a cold wind through a cracked door. Outside, the gate area was filling with murmurs as more passengers from the boarding line overheard pieces of the drama. Phones were out. Videos were being uploaded. Comments were flying. The internet was waking up. And so was Claire's worst nightmare. Back at the gate, Richard stood tall as the station manager finally arrived. He explained everything in calm, measured tones, but his words cut sharper than any raised voice ever could. He wasn't asking for compensation. He wasn't demanding apologies. He was preparing to make a decision, a very big one. And before this day ended, Claire would learn exactly what it meant to disrespect a man who didn't just ride first class, but ran the airline. While Claire returned to prepping for takeoff, completely unaware of the storm she had just invited, Richard Allen stepped to the side of the gate and made one simple move. He tapped his Bluetooth headset, his voice calm but sharp. "Get me Harold on the board. Now." The gate agent, watching from a distance, nearly dropped his tablet. Because here's what Claire and most of the crew didn't know. Richard Allen wasn't just another passenger in an expensive suit. He wasn't a celebrity or some businessman trying to impress anyone. He was the CEO of the entire airline. Zenith Air, a global aviation powerhouse, had acquired the smaller regional carrier, SkyConnect, just 6 months ago as part of a major expansion. And though Richard now had authority over everything from fleet operations to hiring policies, he had intentionally chosen to keep a low profile during the transition. Why? Because Richard believed in one thing above all: truthful experience. "I don't want red carpets," he once told his board. "I want to see what our passengers go through unfiltered. That's the only way we'll ever fix what's broken." So, every few months, he would fly, unannounced, undocumented, completely under the radar. No private jets, no staff, just him and his family, booking flights like everyone else, observing, listening, taking notes. Today, that decision paid off in a way no executive could have planned. Because today, he had walked directly into the exact kind of discrimination, arrogance, and broken culture he'd spent his career fighting to eliminate. And the evidence wasn't just anecdotal anymore. It was being recorded, whispered about, and soon, it would go viral. The line connected. A familiar voice came through. "Richard, what's going on?" Richard stepped away from the crowd, voice low but steady. "I just had my family removed from a flight. First class. Fully paid. Because the flight attendant decided, based on nothing, that we didn't belong." A pause. "You're kidding." "I wish I was. I want a conference call with legal, HR, and the SkyConnect executive team within the hour. And Harold," his voice darkened slightly, "pull up employee number 49327. Her name's Claire." Harold didn't need to ask why. Back on the plane, Claire stood by the front galley, double-checking the passenger manifest with a frown. Something was off. The gate staff looked nervous. A few murmurs had reached her ears. Then a passenger leaned toward her and whispered, "You know that guy you kicked off? That's Richard Allen. The Richard Allen." Her face paled. Her hands trembled. And just like that, the power she thought she had slipped right through her fingers. 15 minutes after Claire handed out orange juice to first class and gave a picture-perfect, plastic smile to the cabin, the plane began to taxi toward the runway. She strolled down the aisle like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just humiliated a family in front of dozens of people. She was even starting to relax. The hardest part of the flight was over, she thought. But just as the aircraft made its slow turn toward the runway, the unexpected happened. The plane stopped. Not the usual pause for traffic. Not a weather delay. A complete, sudden stop on the tarmac. Passengers glanced around, murmuring. Then, the cockpit door opened slightly. A few tense seconds passed before the pilot's calm voice came through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to return to the gate due to a company directive. Please remain seated." A wave of confusion rippled through the plane. Claire frowned, glancing toward the front of the aircraft. "Company directive? That doesn't make sense," she muttered. "Flight attendants don't usually get involved in those kinds of orders, unless something big is happening." As the plane slowly turned and began heading back to the terminal, Claire felt the weight of eyes turning toward her. She tried to keep her smile in place, but the muscles in her cheeks twitched. The energy had shifted, and she could feel it. The murmurs grew louder as passengers speculated. Is there a bomb threat? Mechanical issue? Did someone complain? Claire's gut told her something else, something she didn't want to believe. Minutes later, the plane came to a halt back at the gate. The door opened. Claire stood near the galley, arms folded, waiting to greet whoever was coming aboard. Probably a maintenance tech, maybe an airport marshal. But then she saw them. The same security team that had escorted the Allen family off the plane earlier stepped through the door again. Only this time, they weren't alone. 3 people followed behind them, all dressed in sharp suits, all with stern expressions. and all wearing the unmistakable ID badges of Zenith Air Corporate. Claire's heart sank. The lead executive, a tall black woman in a charcoal gray blazer, walked up the jet bridge with authority, scanning the plane like she already knew the full story. Behind her were two senior HR officials, one holding a clipboard, the other an open tablet. Claire's fake smile froze on her face. Her voice cracked as she asked, "Can I help you?" The lead executive didn't stop walking. "We'll take it from here," she said firmly. Then, turning toward the passengers, she raised her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We need just a few minutes of your time to address a personnel issue. Your cooperation is appreciated." Claire's face drained of color. Her mind raced. Personnel issue? Here. Now. The passengers now fully understood this was no mechanical delay. This was about her. The executives huddled for a moment. Then the lead woman turned to Claire. "Claire, you're to step off the aircraft immediately. Bring your things." Claire blinked. "Excuse me. You're being temporarily relieved of duty pending an internal investigation. You will be escorted to a private conference room where you can give your statement." Passengers gasped. Several phones discreetly captured the moment. "This is a misunderstanding," Claire stammered. "I was just following protocol. That family, they didn't look like—" She stopped herself, but the words had already betrayed her. The HR rep shook his head. "You should stop talking." Claire's voice dropped to a whisper. "Wait, is this about that man? That Richard?" The lead executive didn't blink. "Yes, Mr. Allen is our CEO, and your actions this morning were witnessed by over 50 passengers, security, and now, several million people online." Claire's knees nearly gave out. She grabbed the seat back to steady herself. "Online," she whispered. "What do you mean online?" A nearby passenger turned his phone to face her. The screen showed a video, her video, already racking up hundreds of thousands of views. The caption, "Flight attendant kicks black family out of first class. Turns out they own the airline." Claire's jaw dropped. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then the final blow landed. One of the execs pulled out a company tablet and displayed a live feed from the airline CEO message board. Richard Allen's face filled the screen. A message at the top read, "To all Zenith and SkyConnect employees, there will be zero tolerance for discrimination at any level of this company. Today's events are being addressed immediately and publicly." Claire didn't say another word. She collected her things in silence, her hands shaking as she placed her scarf and service binder into her tote. She didn't look at the passengers as she walked back down the jet bridge, but they were all looking at her, and none of them would forget what they had just witnessed. Because sometimes, karma doesn't wait until the end of the flight. Sometimes it returns to the gate before takeoff. Claire Matthews stood frozen near the front galley, her hands gripping the beverage cart for balance. The weight of the moment was crushing her, and it was about to get worse. A woman in a dark navy blazer stepped onto the plane. She walked with the commanding presence of someone used to taking charge in high-stakes situations. Behind her were two other officials, all wearing corporate Zenith Air ID badges clipped to their jackets. The lead woman approached with a hard, unreadable stare. "Flight attendant Claire Matthews?" she asked, her tone firm and devoid of sympathy. Claire swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "Why, yes, that's me." The woman didn't blink. "You're being removed from this flight, effective immediately, pending internal investigation." Gasps echoed through the first-class cabin. Passengers sat upright, glancing at each other in disbelief. Whispers swirled through the rows. Claire's face turned pale. "WI? What's going on?" The woman stepped in closer. "The CEO would like to speak with you. Now." Claire's heart dropped. Her ears rang. Her knees threatened to give out. The CEO? The same man she had kicked off the flight? The man she had accused of lying about his first-class ticket? It was suddenly clear to her. The man wasn't just a VIP. He was the VIP. Panic crawled up her spine as she tried to collect her thoughts. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Claire stammered. "I didn't know who he was. I was just doing my job." The executive cut her off. "You were enforcing a policy that doesn't exist. You made assumptions based on appearance, and you created a hostile environment for paying passengers. That's not just bad service, that's liability. Claire looked to the other flight attendants, hoping someone might speak up, but they all stood silent, avoiding her eyes. No one was coming to save her. The executive motioned to the security officers behind her. You will be escorted to the executive conference suite at gate C21, where Mr. Allen is waiting. Claire's hands trembled as she slowly gathered her personal items, a service binder, a scarf, her flight manual. Her fingers fumbled with her badge as she clipped it to her bag instead of her chest. As she turned to step off the plane, she could feel all the passengers watching. Not one of them spoke in her defense. A child whispered to his mother, "Is she in trouble?" The mother nodded solemnly. She should be. Claire walked down the jet bridge in silence, her footsteps echoing like drumbeats of shame. Every step took her closer to a meeting she never imagined, one with the man she had wronged, disrespected, and humiliated in front of the world. And now, it was her turn to explain herself. The air inside the executive lounge was thick with silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the runway, but all eyes in the room were locked on one man, Richard Allen. He was no longer the quiet, composed father in a tailored suit escorting his family onto a flight. He was now every bit the CEO of Zenith Air, commanding, centered, and unshakably calm. His expression was unreadable, his posture upright, every movement precise. The quiet power he carried was louder now, undeniable. Across from him, Claire Matthews was ushered in by two HR officials. Her footsteps faltered the moment she stepped inside. As soon as her eyes locked with Richard's, her face drained of all color. "You," she gasped, barely above a whisper. Her voice trembled with disbelief. Richard didn't respond right away. He waited until the weight of the room settled onto her shoulders. Then, in a tone that was low and deliberate, he began. "Earlier today," he said, "you accused my family of lying, harassed them in front of other passengers, and had them removed from a flight they rightfully paid for." Claire opened her mouth. I didn't know." Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "That's the problem," he interrupted, eyes never leaving hers. "You didn't know. And yet, you acted like you did. You judged us, my wife, my children, and me, based not on facts, not on policies, but on your assumptions." Claire's eyes welled up. She was visibly shaking now. "I didn't mean to." "No," Richard said sharply, his calm now edged with steel. "You didn't mean to get caught. You didn't mean for there to be consequences. But you didn't mean to question us. You meant to challenge our right to sit in first class. You meant to weaponize your authority without cause." He paused. "And the truth is, you thought you could get away with it." Claire's knees weakened. She glanced around the room, perhaps searching for someone to intervene, someone to rescue her. No one did. One of the HR officials handed her a printed document, her incident report, filled with witness statements, timestamps, and even a clip from a security camera showing her confrontation with the Allen family. Claire's hands trembled as she looked it over. "I've built this company," Richard continued, "on the belief that every customer, no matter their background, deserves respect and dignity. I've fought for diversity in every department, from pilots to executives. And today, you made a mockery of that." Claire finally blurted out, "I was just doing my job." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Your job is to ensure safety and comfort, not to become judge and jury on who you think belongs. You failed at that job. Miserably." The room went still again. And then Richard did something unexpected. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Claire, let me ask you a question." She nodded nervously. "If we weren't who we were, if I was just a regular black father flying with my family, what would have happened to us today?" Claire didn't answer. She couldn't, because everyone in that room already knew. "You would have sent us off that plane with no investigation, no apology, no accountability," Richard said. "And you would have gone on serving orange juice like nothing happened." He turned to the HR team. "You have everything you need for your review." Then he looked back at Claire. "You may not have recognized me when I boarded that plane, but from now on, I promise you, you'll remember exactly who I am. And more importantly, what I stand for." Claire wiped her face, humiliated. Her voice cracked. Is this the end of my job?" "That's not for me to decide," Richard said. "That's up to the policies you ignored. But actions have consequences. And today, you learned that even the clouds can't hide you from accountability." He stood, gave a brief nod to the HR team, and walked out of the room with the same calm confidence he had entered with, leaving Claire behind, her career and credibility hanging by a thread. As the door closed, Claire sank into the nearest chair, face buried in her hands. For once, she didn't have anything left to say. By the time the plane was halfway through its delayed boarding process, the story had already left the tarmac and was soaring across the internet. A passenger in row 3 had filmed everything, from the moment Claire challenged Richard and his family, to the humiliating walk down the jet bridge under the gaze of dozens of watching eyes. It was all captured on a smartphone. The video was just under 2 minutes long, but it said more than any press release ever could. In it, you could clearly hear Claire's voice, sharp with suspicion, as she asked, "Where did you get these tickets?" You could see the confusion on Maria's face, the discomfort in Richard's son as he clutched his backpack, and finally, the silent pain in Richard's eyes as security approached. That night, the clip was uploaded to social media with a title that sent shockwaves across the country. Black CEO kicked off on Airline by racist flight attendant.